All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So thank you for joining today. Today we're going to be talking about Grant Success 101, the back of the house foundations for frontline CBOs. Next slide. Like I mentioned earlier, please continue to throw in the chat where you're calling from, your name, where you're calling from, your pronouns, and anything you're excited about learning. And maybe throw in a little bit of information if you haven't already about your experience with federal grants. Next slide. Today we're going to be talking about, we're going to start with talking about grounding our work. We're going to talk a little bit about Justice 40 and some grant basics. Then we're going to provide a brief overview of federal grant requirements, especially from an accountant, financial and compliance perspective. We're also going to talk a little bit more about the operations and HR questions. Then we're going to jump straight into our panel and spend the majority of time doing some Q&A with our panelists. I'll go ahead and start off with some questions that we've already prepared, and then we'll open it up to Q&A from the audience. And then we're going to do a quick photo. We're going to give a little bit of reminders about where we are with our webinar series, as well as fundraising. And then we're going to ask you to prepare a survey. Next slide. My name's Joan. I am the Colaborativo 40 director at Green Latinos. I have 20 years of campaign community engagement experience. I've recently helped Green Latinos get a $25 million USDA urban forestry grant. And I have worked on over $500 million of federal government proposals. As you'll see in this slide, as well as a few other slides, there's some QR codes that you could go ahead and scan and get more information about me or some of the other panelists as we're diving into this presentation. Colaborativo 40 works to connect partners and the Latino community with resources, technical assistance, partnerships, and opportunities so we can get the most out of Justice 40 funds and try to get federal grant dollars for our community. Next slide. I'll let Brent talk about his background.
Thanks, Joan. I'm Brent Wilkes. I'm the Senior Vice President for Institutional Development for Hispanic Federation. And I work, of course, on our development objectives for the organization. I've been involved with Latino organizations for over 30 years now, close to 35. Focused on public policy, program development, nonprofit management, and Latino advocacy work. Before, with the work with the Hispanic Federation, I was with the League of United Latin American Citizens. And Hispanic Federation is really focused on helping Latino nonprofits. We have 650 members and partners that we provide advice and support to around the country. And we're operating currently in 42 states, Puerto Rico, and DC. So thanks for including me in the show. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Next slide. Amy?
Yes, my name is Amy Villela. I am a principal and the director of client accounting services with Weinberg Partners. I am a CMA with over 20 years experience working with compliance, both with federal, local, and state granting authorities. Through our firm, we offer fractional CFO services. We do political compliance reporting, financial accounting, and help out organizations with their grants compliance and reporting, and making sure that they're safe and covered, ready for any audits or reporting requirements of grants that they receive. So I'm really excited to be here today.
Thank you. Next slide. Macy? We're going to go ahead and skip. Oh, Macy. Yes, please.
I'm Macy Hughes. I'm the Vice President for Urban Forestry for American Forests, and we are leading a movement in tree equity. And for that, we mean to ensure that the investments that we've helped unlock, like the IRA funding and the EPA funding that are now trickling down, that those funds get into the communities that need them the most. So the work that we do in the Catalyst Initiative is to ensure that we're deploying the funds in the communities that are going to need to adapt to climate change the fastest, right? And we're also ensuring that we're doing this in an equitable way. And so that's my job. And hopefully our experience working on these federal grants will be helpful for you today as well.
Thanks, Macy. So what is Justice 40? Justice 40 is President Biden's historical commitment that 40% of federal government funds are invested in disadvantaged communities that are marginalized, underserved, and burdened by pollution. So that essentially means a lot of our communities that we naturally serve as CBOs, as municipalities, higher education institutions, are the ones that would automatically qualify for Justice 40 and these kind of federal grants. But as we kind of see earlier last year that this is a President Biden initiative. So after 2024, these kind of federal grants may not be available if there's a change in administration. Because the first thing when we got a new speaker that they tried to do was try to get rid of these historic investments in environment, in green causes, and in our communities. What kind of investments fall within Justice 40? We have everything from climate change to clean transportation, clean water, and affordable housing, and all the other ones that are listed here. As Macy mentioned, Justice 40 is being implemented through the Inflation Reduction Act, bipartisan infrastructure law, and the American Rescue Plan. These are just the laws and the bills that were implemented in order to get these kind of investments in green dollars in the green community. And where are these grant dollars? These grant dollars are within 15 different agencies within the federal government. So when you're trying to unlock these funds, don't just look at the EPA, look at other kinds of agencies within the federal government. Look at the USDA, HUD, even NASA has some federal grant dollars that have this specific kind of investment in our community. Next slide. This is just a sample amount of the amount of dollars that are on the table as part of this historic Justice 40 investment. We have everything from $27 billion that is in the pipeline through the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, that's through the EPA, to this $2 billion community change grant that we've been talking about over the last month, to USDA urban forestry at 10 million, to HUD. So please look around as you're looking into federal grant dollars and how you could take advantage of them. Next slide. So providing some little bit of grant basics, because up until this webinar, we've been talking more about the application within the federal grant process. Today, we're going to move over a little bit more to the implementation. What does that mean? How can we prepare now, even while we're preparing our applications, our proposals, or once we finally submit, to be best prepared to take advantage of these dollars? Because federal grants oftentimes require a ton of things in the back of the house that you may not automatically assume that you need to do prior to getting the federal grant. And that's what we're laying the foundation for today in this webinar. Next slide. Next slide. So these are a few of the, I'm going to review some of the requirements just very briefly. I won't read it, but there's a general accepted accounting principles requirement. There's an audit requirement. We're obviously going to share these slides with you so you can read them more in depth if you like, but I'd like to jump more into the panel discussion, but we can use this as a reference. Next slide. We have a reporting and compliance requirement that is super important as we're looking towards getting these grants and being able to implement them successfully, so that that we continue to get grant dollars and that we are good stewards of the money that we receive. Next slide. There's also the big question of payments. You might think, okay, we're going to get the federal grant dollars and it's going to be similar to how we receive grant dollars from foundations. When we're looking at specifically federal grant dollars, they can come in two different types of payment structures, through advances and through reimbursements. And that might be very important as we're talking about cash flow for your organization, because as we know, frontline CBOs oftentimes don't have the cash flow or the resources necessarily to front millions, if not billions of dollars to other organizations or for their projects, and then to get reimbursed from the federal government. So it's really important that we also understand the advance process, and there's a reimbursement process to get actually paid for the work that we're doing in our communities. Next slide. This is more from an operations perspective, and there's a few other things that I think are important. We have the Buy America Act, which, as we're talking about the Community Change Grant, is really important, especially as we're looking at infrastructure and as far as maybe some things that we might have to buy to equip ourselves to actually do the work we're proposing to do. There's exceptions to every rule, or to a lot of these rules. So that's also true with the Buy America Act. Next slide. We have to have a drug-free workplace as well. And so that I know that as we're talking about, what we currently have, that might be obvious, but, there's not a federal, there's no federal law that makes marijuana legal. It's like state by state. So that might be one of the things that you have to think about, having a drug policy at your organization that may not be in effect. Next slide. A procurement policy, that's how you go ahead and get new hires and vendors sometimes. And so it has to be a competitive process. And there's a few different regulations in order to make sure that you actually have a competitive process when you're looking to outsource some of the work you're doing, because obviously, as we talked about with the Community Change Grant and some of these other grants, there are things that we cannot do in-house, right? For example, with Green Latinos, we're not arborists. We're not people who are going to be experts in telling you what kind of trees should be planted, but we are very experienced in doing that kind of community engagement and that community outreach and knowing what our community needs. So the procurement policy comes in through that to make sure that we can bring in the expertise needed to provide the work that we're talking about within the federal government. Next slide. And there's some other basic requirements too with a lot of these federal grants that are coming up. Devin Baker that talks about labor standards. We have Justice 40 reporting, and we also have signage that talks about the work that we'll be doing. Next slide. We have eligible workers, so pretty much any kind of laws in the United States that ensure that all employees complete their I-9. No texting while driving, and a prohibition against confidentiality agreements that might already exist within our organizations. Next slide. That being said, we'd like to take a quick photo and then jump into our panel. So if everyone who puts in their happiest face for the photo, please do so now. Kumbia.
Okay, 1, 2, 3.
All right. I think we're going through we have a few different pages of this, so make sure to continue to smile if we need to. All right, next slide. We're going to jump into our panel Q&A at this moment. So I'd like to go ahead and invite our panelists to come off mute, and we're going to start off with the question. So Brent, would you like to answer? We'll start off with you. Can you talk about what surprised you most about federal grants?
So I'm going to give two surprises, one good and one bad, I guess. One is that despite the fact that it is a significant investment of time and effort to write a federal grant, there's actually a pretty straightforward process for applying. It's all kind of spelled out in the Notice of Funding Opportunity. And it's really important to study that document closely and to answer all the questions in there. I tend to be somebody that likes logic. So for me, it's like, okay, make sure I answer all the questions. If all the questions answered, then we're done and we submit the proposal. And so it's actually, for me, kind of a fun to write federal proposals. And so I was kind of surprised about that because I anticipated it being much more difficult. And it is in terms of time investment, but you almost think of it as a defensive process. You think of yourself starting off with a score of 100 and wanting to make sure that the readers of the proposal can't take a point off for any of the questions that are asked. So you need to be defending your 100 points. Now, I'm not going to say that every agency goes with 100 points and that's the formula, but generally you're going to have somebody reading the proposal and they're looking to deduct points for things that you didn't answer properly or they don't feel like you answered it in a way that gives them confidence that you can handle the proposal. So I think that's something that I found that was really helpful. It's just you kind of got it all in front of you. Defend your score and make sure you answer every question in the application. The part that I found surprising actually kind of turned up recently because with the Biden administration, there's an emphasis on working with disadvantaged communities that typically haven't had a chance to get federal grants before. This whole Justice 40 initiative, for example, is an example of that, where they're working to try to reach out to organizations that are on the front lines, but typically haven't been getting federal opportunities. So I had thought, well, if that's what they want, we'll get that. We'll make sure we reach out to those local nonprofits, and they'll be understanding that perhaps those nonprofits aren't quite as ready for all the federal compliance issues that like a Beltway focused organization like, I don't know, Rand Corporation or for something like that, that's done this for 100 years and is based here in Washington and knows all the ins and outs of federal contract compliance. But no, you have to follow the same rules that everybody else does, regardless of how small or how disadvantaged, or if it's the first time you ever got the grant. The fact is that they're not going to, your program officer may give you a little bit of wiggle room, but they'll never say that whatever reg you're concerned about doesn't apply, because they can't. Everything that's in the uniform guidance has to be followed, both for that agency as well as for OPM. And so despite the focus here on reaching out to diverse populations, there's really not any forbearance in terms of applying some of these more difficult regulations for nonprofits. And that's true not just for the prime applicant, but also for any subgrantee that they bring on as part of the grant. So that's the surprise. So I'm telling you so you don't get surprised. Hopefully that won't happen to you.
Amy, would you like to talk a little bit about what surprised you about federal grants?
Well, I think for a lot of organizations, especially smaller organizations, they're not going to be as readily prepared as necessary to financially be ready for these grants. And a lot of it comes down to reporting. And so the amount of cleanup and the effort and time that's involved can be extensive if you've been in an organization that's been active for many years. So, not having that, the adequate time to actually have the procedures and policies set up internally for accounting and having your books in a place where you can do the reporting is something that's going to be faced by a lot of organizations that are stepping up to these larger grants. And the most important, is having the infrastructure in the accounting department. And that's usually one of the places that organizations, they're excellent at delivering what they are in existence for. But the accounting, for most part, usually is going to be a little bit subpar. And the reporting requirements are not that difficult if you have the infrastructure set up. So I think a lot of organizations are going to be surprised at how much changes are going to need to be taken in order to be in a position to report adequately and accurately for these grants. And that is key, not only to stay in a good position with the current grant you're within now, but also be in a position to obtain grants in the future. It does open up a whole nother can of worms, which we can talk about later, but for auditing and other things that come down the line. But having that infrastructure is key.
Macy, would you like to talk about what surprised you about federal grants the most?
I think the points that were raised are excellent points. I think that what I tend to forget, especially if you're sort of doing an application process kind of on your own and you're siloed, I forget that there's somebody else on the other end of that application process. And then if you're successful, right, then you get introduced to, a handful of people who are legitimately people, with all that comes with, right? Flawed, well-meaning people who will actually be willing to collaborate with you in a way that can set you up for success. And to me, that's unexpected from the government. And so that was a pleasant surprise, just kind of like being mindful that it's also an opportunity to create relationships that can be leveraged for future opportunities. And some of the grants we have with the U.S. Forest Service are even like the pet projects of the people in the U.S. Forest Service that they wanted to find somebody to caretake and like implement, but it was their idea. And then it's kind of really this lovely experience of getting to kind of actualize someone else's idea for them, kind of working towards this common goal. And there's something really beautiful about that. And I would have never woken up on any given day and said, oh yeah, working with the government can be beautiful. But it has been in my experience. And so that was a pleasant surprise.
Thank you. So what can an organization, a frontline CBO, do now to prepare for a federal grant? How about we jump around? Like, Amy, would you like to talk about what an organization can do now to prepare for a federal grant?
Definitely. One of the first things you'll need to do is start looking at your accounting systems, creating policies and procedures, making sure that you have adequate designations for people to do things so that you have policies in place that are going to meet the requirements of the grant. Also, you need to set up your system to be able to track by grant and by funding stream, because not only is it a requirement for a lot of these to be audited, but once you start getting larger grants, the auditing goes to a whole nother level. It goes into the big boys level. And so they're not going to just be pulling. So in a typical grant, for those who are on here, in case you don't know, in a typical audit, they're going to be pulling certain revenues, entries, and expenses, and they're going to check to make sure they match your supporting documentation. So having that readily available is a key. But when you get to the larger ones, they're going to start actually going into each and every program, making sure that all the expenses and revenue that has been attributed to those programs are actually meeting the requirements of the grant. So the first starting place is to make sure you have that structure in place. It's easier to do before you start in the grants and funding streams, or before you get a lot of them, than to try to go backwards. If you get caught doing things or putting expenses that aren't allowed, you could really be putting your company and your organization at a risk of having to actually pay those funds back on this grant and possibly inhibit your organization from getting future grants. And, so it's very important to start there and setting up that foundation to make sure that you're able to really track appropriately and accurately and setting a good reputation for your organization with these granting authorities.
Macy, would you like to talk about what an organization can do now to prepare?
Absolutely. I mean, I think Amy sort of mentioned like making sure, or the subtext of that is to make sure you know the rules, right? And one of the things that we tend to do with large federal grants is to get a separate bank account for them, just to make it easier for you to manage, especially if the amount of funds dwarf your current operating experience, right? Like you want those funds to not be commingled in a way that can mess up how your program operates. And so we tend to have a separate bank account for that. And I think, we sort of to acknowledge too, even attending webinars like this or talking to people you may know who have had experience working with federal grants, just to get familiar with that, making sure that you're talking to and learning as you go. I mean, I think the first time anybody does anything, it can be a little disconcerting. So one way to control for that is to collect as much information and insider perspective as you can get. And I think that really does kind of help to provide you with information that you may not be thinking about.
Brent, same question to you. What can an organization do now to prepare?
No, I'm going to mention something that's simple, but has to be done, which is to register with sam.gov and grants.gov, only because that has been an issue when I've encouraged organizations to apply for federal grants. Oftentimes they haven't already registered. And the process can be long, not necessarily because, well, it does take time to actually fill it out, honestly. So it's lengthy on your end to get registered, but it's also lengthy on the government's end to approve it. It can take up to 3 months. So if you have a grant due in less than 3 months and you haven't got your sam.gov, you're kind of like already not able to apply right from the start. The one good thing I did find out about the subrecipients, not every grant requires that they're also registered with grants.gov, but some of them do. But you can do kind of the minimum, SAMS.gov, you can do kind of the minimum registration for that doesn't have the full registration with all the compliance things checked. And I think the second thing is just that the compliance, and there's some similarities here. If you go through a SAM.gov registration, they're going to be asking a lot of compliance related questions. But it's helpful to get a good sense of the grant that you're looking at, what the compliance is going to be, and to make sure you just ask yourself and your team, do we have all of these things in order so that we can show that we are in compliance with this grant? Because before the first dollar hits your bank account, you want to make sure that you're set up, that you are compliant. It is, Amy's absolutely right. You can't do it after the fact if you've already been kind of doing it the wrong way. And so that's a really important process to go through. But if you do the sam.gov registration, you should kind of have a lot of those kind of general governmental questions about compliance, and then look through the NOFO and pick up the additional compliance requirements and be prepared. And definitely, the big thing is going to be the fiscal. I like the recommendation of a separate bank account. We don't do that, but if your financial controls are pretty strong, you don't have to have a separate bank account for government grants, but you have to really segregate the reporting and the spending so that there's no question that whatever was spent on the grant was related to that grant, because that's the commingling of funds can be the first thing that gets you in serious trouble.
Macy, I think you had something to add.
I did. I got super excited. I think this sort of getting your house in order, that kind of the idea of knowing all of the requirements and making sure all of your paperwork is together is something you can also take as an approach to applying for a grant. And this is kind of building off of what Brent was saying. I think the process, I think what happens is you'll see like the opportunity and you'll start thinking about what program you want to create to apply for. And I think the most effective way to start the application process is to look at all of the paperwork requirements and get all of those together first before you even start writing your narrative. And then it's almost like starting backwards. Start with the budget, start with all of your forms, because the process of actually, if you're missing something and gathering that can be incredibly time consuming. And then even take a look at your programs that you're currently offering and think of them through a lens of potentially a match for whatever you're applying for. And thinking about how these federal funds can amplify the work that you're already doing, and then write your narrative. Because most of the time what happens is a lot of people, and this definitely happened with the IRA, a lot of people will wait till the last minute or be down to the wire, and they'll flood the system with trying to get their narrative and all of their supplemental documentations all uploaded to the system at the same time, and the system may not be able to bear it on the actual due date, right? But if you've started that before you've done anything else, all you have to do is get your narrative uploaded in your budget and you'll be good. So just strategically do the hard stuff, tedious stuff first, fun stuff later.
Amy, did you have something to add?
I did, yes. This might seem very simple, but I mean, I finally have gotten through on ours, but like print them off. Whatever you get, print it off, highlight it, and then work off a budget. And then you've got to make sure you've got that. This is from the accounting side of it. Make sure you've got that in your system. You understand exactly once you've gotten the award. You should know this by when you're actually submitting. But once you've been awarded the amount, you know what that is. Make sure that you have that in your system and that you're working constantly off that and checking back actual to budget. I would recommend printing it off, highlighting, doing whatever you need to do, especially in your first couple ones when you're new on it. But making sure you understand completely, because what you don't want to do is be spending in an area that you're not going to be able to be reimbursed in, and putting your organization in a risky situation financially, especially if you're new. Knowing and understanding that budget and where you are, I wouldn't wait till it's reporting time or reimbursement time to look and see how you're tracking against it. And again, this is really towards those newer organizations. I would be doing a weekly review with your management, looking and seeing what the spend has already been, what you're projecting it to be, and making sure you're staying within those guidelines and adjusting as you go, not waiting again till the end. And once you have those set up, most of the smaller ones, I won't talk about the large end accounting software packages. There's plenty out there that are grants packages, but you don't really need that to begin with. And most probably people are going to be on QuickBooks or something similar like that. Get the projects version of QuickBooks, set up your grants as projects. You can do P&Ls on it immediately in real time, and set up your budget for those in the system. Those are some real good tips I could tell you that just right off the bat, if you get set up with that immediately, you'll set yourself up for success.
Awesome. So Macy, I'm going to popcorn it over to you. How do federal grants change organizations? How have they changed your organization?
Oh, I think there are a number of different ways federal grants change organizations. One, I mean, for American Forest, it changes how we collaborate, right? It changes who you bring to the table just to implement the project. It can be incredibly time-consuming to apply for federal grants, but to implement them can also be time-consuming, especially if you're working under a cooperative agreement, because the idea behind a cooperative agreement is that you're co-creating and delivering work together with the government, which means you have a lot of meetings and need a lot of approvals just to actually perform the work. And that is different than if you have a foundation grant where they give you the money upfront after you win their proposal process, you get the money upfront, and then you do regular check-ins. For grants that are managed by a cooperative agreement, you'll be working with people from the government side every week, just in having conversations, just like you would a coworker. And the project, it feels different to kind of deliver work in that way. And if that is a functional relationship, it's great because you can keep the lines of communication open. You can get a real sense of where you're being successful and where you need opportunities for improvement. You can get help with like reporting and stuff from having that relationship, but it is also very time intensive in a way that other grants aren't. And I think that it really provides organizations with a proof of concept that can be leveraged for other funding opportunities. And to me, that's the biggest opportunity with federal funding, is that you can pilot new ideas, figure out, think of it kind of like seed money for future work, kind of thinking about the work beyond the limits of that term for that federal grant that you have, and how it could be part of your regular delivery of your work. And so I think that that's really fun, but it's totally different in good and bad ways than I think other forms of funding.
So Brent, I'm going to change it up a little bit. Can you maybe talk a little bit about some federal regulations that have been problematic or maybe surprised you a little bit more about implementing federal grants, and what folks might be able to do now to prepare for those federal regulations?
The one that we spent a lot of time on, this is just one of many, and maybe it was not necessary, but the issue of lobbying disclosure was one that has thrown me multiple grants into a conversation with multiple people within the organization. We do lobby and advocacy on behalf of the community, but not to try to get government grants, honestly, mostly like things like immigration reform, or trying to change public policy for the better for the community as a whole. And so there's quite a bit of reporting that we do to the federal government and to various bodies through that process. Typically, we kind of tally up all the lobbying, make sure that we're in compliance with the C3 regulations, and then submit a report. However, the federal agencies, one of the things you'll see when you're filling out grants.gov is there's going to be some sort of lobbying disclosure form. I forgot the exact number for it. And in there, they ask you about any lobbying activities that you've had. And for us, that would be a heck of a lot to fill out, because it's quite a bit of activity. And yet, what I've been able to understand is that question primarily refers to, are you lobbying to get this grant, or something, have you been lobbying this agency to get grants like this? And if you haven't been, what we've been putting in is, no, we don't do any lobbying to get grants here. When we've asked our program officers, however, or the grants folks, they all say, most of the time they've said, no, you got to put it all down in there, which would, prolong the time it takes to apply for the grant. So we haven't done that so far. We haven't gotten in trouble, but it's been something that, there's just not a lot of clarity. And when you do ask, they tell you, yes, put it in. But most of the guidance that I've seen is coming from the universities. They must do a lot of lobbying for their funds. And they typically tell their program team to, just put in what you've been lobbying on this particular grant for that particular question. So that's one that's thrown us off quite a bit. You can get stuck on a lot of this, though. So I would encourage you to, reach out to the folks who are administering the grant process, to ask questions early, because what you don't want to do is end up, 11:30 p.m. the night that the proposal's due, and then realize that you don't understand the question, and then you're in a pickle because there's no way to get a hold folks to ask. So make sure you read through everything. If you got any questions, make sure you ask early to make sure you don't get stuck with a situation like that.
So thanks. Amy, from an accounting perspective, can we maybe just put that emphasis on the difference between foundations and foundation grants and federal grants, and what an organization that maybe doesn't have that accounting or financial expertise can do to get ready, right? Once they get it or while they're applying?
Yeah, so
Perfect.
usually foundation grants or private grants or funding streams, those have far less rigorous reporting requirements than a federal grant. Normally, if they have any financial reporting requirements, some don't. And if they do, it's usually a very simple reporting requirement where you report, in bulk numbers, and there's not a requirement for auditing or things of that sort. When you get into federal grants, that's a whole nother ball field. Now we're talking about, being able to keep receipts with, on all your transactions, making sure that you are, working within the requirements of the procurement of equipment and just basic supplies, that you're keeping within budget, that you and also that you are within the confines of the actual grant. So when you're setting this up, you're going to have to really have someone who understands how that works. And, there is a difference between having someone who has a bookkeeping skill set and versus someone who has grants experience and an accountant. And once you start going for these larger ones, you most likely are going to have to increase the experience level and expertise level in your accounting department to make sure that you are reporting appropriately and accurately. And a lot of small companies, that's a big investment, but it will reap benefits and rewards, because as you get more grants, you're able to deliver, your reporting is accurate. Those will open up some doors for you to get bigger and larger grants. And like I said, then we have the whole other level of auditing requirements, and the large ones will require what we call yellow jacket audits in the accounting department. And those are really intensive audits and require you to have very detailed books that are accurate. And so, again, I cannot stress this enough, is getting set up in the beginning. There are organizations like my own firm that offer accounting services, that aren't full-time staff. If you're a new organization, you can get that kind of guidance. Even if you have people on staff that are doing accounting, it'd be good to hook up with firms that will be able to review and do either a monthly or quarterly review. But making sure you have that in place is really important and imperative for your organization to be successful. And the work that everyone is doing is so important. We'd hate to see these funds not being able to continue going to the organizations and communities that are so desperately in need of these funds. So it really does. This is an integral part of obtaining a grant and making sure you're compliant and you're set up to get future larger grants.
Thank you. We're going to go ahead and open it up to some audience questions. Somebody want to come off of mute or raise their hand and let us know their question? I can start with one I saw in the chat. It was about what technologies can you name some low-cost technologies that organizations can buy now or start using now in order to prepare? Does anybody want to take that? Yeah.
I can answer from the accounting. I think for new organizations, there's a lot of software out there. There's a lot of higher end grant accounting and fund accounting software. If you set it up correctly, it's not necessary. You can start off with something as simple as QuickBooks and make sure you get the advanced so you can get the project level, making sure you have a filing system set up so you can use Google. They've got great security if you want, but you need to make sure you're able to keep accurate records and keep the source documentation. Make sure you have all of that ready to go. So if you do have to go through your first audit, you have that readily available. And there's also ways to capture receipts. So there's things like Receipt Bank, Expensify, Dext. All of those things are very inexpensive that can actually be linked with QuickBooks that will capture your receipts. So you have that, again, that documentation, that source documentation that will, again, set you up for success in audits and being able to refer back to if there's ever an expense that's in question. So that's from the accounting end.
I'd also say it's helpful to think through the grant too and find where the potential financial weaknesses might occur. We had a grant where we were providing payments to farm workers, and we wanted to make sure that the payments were safe up until the point that the farm worker had been given the payment and had been able to document that they were eligible for the particular initiative. And so we ended up developing a custom application to get all the required documentation in, and we provided them with a debit card that had nothing on it to start with, and only had money on it once they'd been verified as eligible for the program. So that saved us a huge amount of headaches. It turned out that there was other grantees that didn't follow the same precautions and had a lot of trouble with fraudulent applications. So I just think it's important to think through, who's handling the money in the grant, who's got the resources of the grants, and to make sure that you kind of have a defensive strategy in place to avoid any type of situation where you'll be in hot water down the line. That wasn't necessarily, I guess I wouldn't necessarily call it a cheap application to write, but it saved us a heck of a lot of time, and it saved our grantees a lot of trouble too, because they didn't have to worry about the documentation. It was all in the app, and they were able to have, in essence, a two-step process of verification. Both they and we would verify that the person was eligible before we actually transferred funds onto the card. So I think that I would definitely look at the grant specifics, what you're proposing to do, and try to set it up for success right from the beginning to make sure that you don't put any funds at risk.
Thank you. I see Clayton has his hand raised. Clayton, would you like to come off of mute?
Of course, and just thank you all so much. This is really informative, and just like some of the previous webinars I've attended, really takes a lot of anxiety out of this process. So thank you all so much. My question is about, what do we do if we apply and then are chosen, but are reduced in the amount of money that we're being offered? So how does the organization react to, say we apply for the $20 million and then the grantor comes back and says, okay, we'll give you 10. How do we go through that process of adjusting? And that's a significant drop in perspective, 50% to lose in the, in the concept. And I'm just curious to hear how you all have worked through that in the past.
I think Macy wants to take that question. Macy, you're on mute.
You lovingly and aggressively and passionately reduce your scope of work to be congruent with the amount of money that they're paying you. And it's still going to cost you more, even when you're in alignment. It's very, like, the labor cost of even having the conversation about how to reduce your scope of work before getting the agreement in place. You'll never recoup those costs, right? And so do it lovingly. You definitely want to have a strong working relationship, because $10 million is still $10 million, right? But you want to make sure that people understand that there's costs associated with the full scope of work. that you can no longer bear, right? And it's in the best interest of your organization to do that unapologetically. Do you know? Like entering it, don't feel like you're entering into that negotiation from a place of weakness. You're entering it because you're a mission-centered organization and you have an obligation to meet your mission, which you can't do unless you're treated fairly. And so definitely right-size your scope of work before you start doing any work.
Wow, thank you so much. So essentially you're saying that we may experience something where they are trying to kind of nickel and dime us down. And is there an opportunity to then retort and come to an agreement in the middle? Like say they come back to us for 10. Should I approach this as fighting for 15?
That's unlikely. I mean, I don't know. Other people might have a different perspective. Usually when you're awarded from like the grantor's perspective, they have a certain amount of money that they're distributing, and that's your cut, right? And so you may not be able to get more money from that same bucket. But what you can do is sign an agreement that makes sense for the amount of money. Like you shouldn't be expected to do the full body of work in a $20 million proposal if you're not given $20 million, right? So what does a $10 million version of that work look like? And that's what you want to put in your agreement.
Yeah, you definitely
Awesome.
you definitely aren't going to be able to negotiate right then and there for more. You can certainly say, hey, the indirect costs are going to go up because now instead of spreading this out over, so you can negotiate some of those things. I'm going to serve less people. It's not exactly half, it's even less than that because I've got more overhead per person. You know, you can do those kind of negotiations. One thing I definitely want to make clear, because it's happened to us, is after you've negotiated the scope again, make sure they put it into the grant system, because I've had a situation where we're reporting and then the high number is still in there because I never went and plugged it in. So you got to make sure that the official record online shows what your new scope of work is. And then the other thing, you can refuse the grant too. If they cut it back too far and you say, gosh, we can't do this anymore. You know, we just can't make this work. This project was really required the full amount. You can say, we're not going to take it. So you're not obligated to move forward with the grant at that point. And then finally, sometimes actually other groups will forfeit the grant at some point during the program period. And so it doesn't hurt to ask your program officers like, hey, how are all the other groups doing? Do you have any, because you know, we applied for Iowa and we didn't get it. But maybe is the group that did get Iowa, are they still moving ahead? And if the program officer needs Iowa served and the other group dropped it, you might actually be able to add that later on in the process. So don't give up hope. There is possibility later on down the line that you could try to get the funds that you had applied for originally restored if the other group that had gotten some of those funds doesn't come through.
Thank you all so much.
We got this one from Irene in the audience. I know Brent kind of already answered it, but I was wondering if maybe anyone had some words of advice or best practices for ensuring your sub-awardees and pass-through projects are ready.
You know, that's where I often get into disagreement with my compliance team, because they want me to pick the most robust, strongest, partners possible that have really strong financial controls and are, large scale organizations. And I'm saying, well, no, the grant says we're supposed to be working with grassroots, community-based organizations that are on the front lines that, potentially aren't necessarily one of these really big outfits. And so there's a bit of a tussle, but I posted our our kind of checklist. And so those are the kind of things that it's really important to go over with the subgrantees ahead of time to make sure that they've got those things in place or are willing to put those things in place. Because regardless of what the NOFO says, you really do have to follow the CFR guidelines. And if the group's just not going to be able to do that, then you know, as much as you want to work with them, you may have to take them off the list. The one caveat I'll give you when we work around here is that contractors are treated differently and their requirements are far less rigorous. Of course, you have to follow the contracting process that we talked about, but it's possible with contractors not to have them have to do as much paperwork as a subgrantee. And so some cases, if you really have to work with this group and you know that they're not going to be able to follow all the federal regulations, you may be able to get them under the contract side of things if, and here's the big if, you have to exercise complete control over what they're doing. So they don't have any program flexibility. You tell them you need so many widgets and they're going to provide so many widgets. And as long as they're willing to do that, you might be able to get them under a contract as opposed to a sub-grant.
Thank you. We're gonna start moving out of Q&A and start moving on to the next slide. Thank you so much for everyone on the panel. Next slide. Reminder that we are still fundraising for the Community Change Grant and trying to get some follow-on work on this. So we'll keep you updated. Next slide. I know there was a question in the chat about what if there's other future webinars. Yes, there is. Actually, our next webinar is next Wednesday at 2 p.m. It's the last part of our series, and we're going to be doing matchmaking for the Community Change Grant. So if you haven't already, please register for this upcoming webinar. It'll be a great opportunity to meet. We're going to try to put people in breakout rooms to try to match folks. And so it'll be a great opportunity to meet other folks in your area that might also be interested in applying. Next slide. And if you haven't already, please go ahead, fill out our survey about the Community Change Grant. We'd love to get your feedback and your thoughts and try to get everybody included in our lists as we're moving forward towards our matchmaking webinar. I want to thank everyone for joining this call today, but especially our panelists, especially Brent from Hispanic Federation, Macy Hughes from American Forests, and Amy Vivella from Weinberg Partners. This wouldn't have been as successful without you. We appreciated your knowledge and your wisdom, and thank you for helping all of us be prepared for federal grants. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Joan.